Good morning and welcome to the Lousy Preachers podcast. We're still not quite sure about the name, but
Prost.
This is Tristan, and that is Pirje.
That is PJ, yes. Pirje, that's actually a nice one. Yeah, the Norwegians say it best, but PJ, Pirje, Peter, whatever you like.
And we are here to present a different topic today, a bit more theological and more to think about, but we're going to explain it as nicely as we can so that also those people who aren't necessarily theologians or scholars can join the discussion. And we're going to have Pirje start for us. Even though I look smarter with my glasses, he actually knows a lot more about the historical context, and he's going to give us an introduction to the historical context of the Heidelberg Disputation, which is a very fundamental document in understanding Luther's theology, but also what our Lutheran church's theology is very much based on, why we preach the way we preach and why we believe certain things.
Warum wir Lutheraner sind, ja?
Genau.
Yeah, thank you, Tristan. Thank you for the introduction. Yeah, I think in our previous episode, we just touched on the surface and gave something of a brief, let's call it a tester for the theology of the cross and accordingly the Heidelberg Disputation. So just to refresh our memories, in 1517, Luther pasted or nailed to the Schlosskirche in Wittenberg the 95 Theses, which we celebrate traditionally as one could say, the start of the Protestant Reformation. But the 95 Theses aren't overtly Protestant documents, and you won't find a lot of evangelical, meaning now in the original sense of the word, theology contained therein. Fast forward 6 months, and you have now the Heidelberg Disputation, from which these 28 theological theses emerge, which are chock full with proper Protestant theology, even if it is only in an embryonic form. So how it worked is Luther's father confessor, Johann von Staupitz, and a good friend of his, Catholic, obviously, Luther at this stage also still Catholic, arranged with the cloister of monks in Erfurt, where Tristan will be studying, where Tristan will be doing his vicariat very soon, though not in the Augustinian cloister. Staupitz organized a debate or a disputation for Luther, giving him a platform to defend the theology that he has put forth in these 28 theses. This very much Protestant theology. And Luther then, along with a bunch of other theologians from Wittenberg, head to Erfurt and there engage in this disputation. He does so very much still as a Catholic, which is beginning to see clearly the problems as he regarded it, and as Protestants throughout the ages have regarded it, with Roman Catholic theology about faith and works. Luther goes on in the theses to formulate this as the theology of glory, as opposed to a theology of the cross. But I'm not going to jump the gun. We'll get to that in a bit. Perhaps, though, I thought that it might be useful for our listeners, perhaps especially for those who are not familiar with Protestant church history or Reformation church history, to just give something of an overview of how sin and grace worked in the context of medieval Catholicism. Because this is going to be important to keep in mind when you note Luther's language, his speaking of sin, his speaking of righteousness, etc. So in the medieval Roman Catholic Church, one is born in a state of original sin, which means that one is born de facto being separate from God and not in right relation to him. Then, within 7 days, one is baptized. And during the sacrament of baptism, grace is now infused into the infant, and original sin is taken away. You receive a regeneration and a forgiveness for all of your original sin. Funnily enough, this is why the Emperor Constantine only got baptized on his deathbed, but that's a little bit of extra information which isn't pertinent to our discussion. And then after your baptism, though, after your baptism, you find yourself in a state of grace. You are in right relation to God and worthy of being in his presence in time and in eternity. But then life happens. Sin emerges onto the stage, and on account of sin, one finds oneself again removed from grace. One finds oneself again separated to some extent or another from God. In the Roman Catholic system, then, this kicks in. There is an entire structure which has been presented for one to get back into the state of grace. Firstly, the sinner has to go to confession, go to a priest. And I mean, this is probably that aspect of Roman Catholicism which is most familiar to all of our viewers, where the poor sinner sits in the confessional and says, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." And then there's either a mob boss waiting for him or a true priest listening patiently to his confession. But the priest then hears the penitent's confession of sins, rather exhaustive, and the priest then pronounces absolution, in which he forgives the person their sins in the place of Christ. But the story doesn't end there, because the priest also pronounces penance upon the sinner, which is basically works of satisfaction, good works of satisfaction that the sinner has to do in order to claim this forgiveness, which the priest has now pronounced. And in order to, well, satisfy for the sins, like to make up for the wrong that one has done to God, and then to an extent to strengthen the soul so that sin doesn't so easily get a hold of you again. And after this entire elaborate system, one is again in a state of grace until you sin again. And then you repeat the whole order on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, for as long as you live. And even then, you're not quite finished with it, because once one dies, you have some sins which have been forgiven and some which haven't. And these then are put into two categories in the Catholic system. You have venial sins and mortal sins. Now, venial sins are those little sins, the lesser sins which we commit that put strain on our relationship to God, but it doesn't completely separate us from him or from grace. And then you have mortal sins, which are grievous breakings of God's law, which do indeed separate you completely from grace and from God. Now, venial sins at the moment of your death that haven't been confessed and you haven't been forgiven for them, you haven't done penance for them, all of the venial sins which you've not been forgiven for, you go to purgatory to pay off in the Catholic system, which is some intermediate state between heaven and hell. Or let's put it this way, between death and heaven. You go to purgatory, and there you work off the venial sins which you've not confessed and not been forgiven for. The mortal sins that you commit are those which you have not confessed and have not done penance for. And those do separate you eternally then from God, and they send you to hell. Now, on this note of mortal sin sending one straight to hell, I have a little Lutheran anecdote which will feature later in the talk. But this system basically is what is going on in medieval Catholicism, and to a large extent, it's this exact system that pushes Luther into the monastery to begin with, because he has to do penance. He has to get into the system to work off his many sins. And I find it is no small coincidence that his father confessor is the one who orchestrates a debate for him to discuss his problems with the system. And then fast forward to end of April 1518 in the city of Erfurt at the Augustinian order, Luther sets forth the 28 theological theses and some philosophical, we won't get to them, of the Heidelberg Disputation in order to address the system. Tristan, perhaps you jump away with it from there.
Yeah. Pierre, you're smarter than you look. And
I don't know whether that's a compliment or an insult.
But thank you for that description. I think it's a very helpful illustration, and I hope our listeners actually watched and didn't only listen. But yeah, I would say fast forward to today, and why are we still talking about this? I mean, this was happening hundreds of years ago, and the language is also quite different and difficult to understand sometimes. And Luther makes here very theological, complicated points. But I would say the main point here is, first of all, to get rid of the idea that we somehow have to satisfy God, or that anything can satisfy God that is human made, basically. And that includes our good heart or our good works or our our holiness or something like that, that somehow gets us closer to God. This is the Heidelberg Disputation is one of the first documents where Luther makes or starts making it clear in his theology that we can't actually get closer to God by anything that we do. Even if we confess all the sins we can possibly think of, which he literally tried to do, we still can't actually get rid of all of them by what we do or say or confess. And in this framework, then there's a very good idea, I think, that Paul Tillich helps us with, which is that if we want to be accepted by God, we have to get rid of this idea that we have to do something to be accepted. In our modern day, we are often expected to achieve things at our work or in business, or we want to raise our status, we want to look good, all things that we kind of do, and it's about how we look. And then when you bring this kind of thinking before God, then you might also think, how do I look before God or how does God see me? How have I climbed up the ladder to heaven? And then Paul Tillich says very famously, accept that you are accepted. And this is based on the fact that all the things we try to do to please God are unacceptable, or they're not worthy of acceptance. The only thing that is worthy of acceptance is what Christ did on the cross for us. And based on that, God accepts us and definitely accepts us without a doubt. I might have sprung a bit far here.
That's all right. That's
Yeah.
all right. Because I think you definitely also threw a line in the water here that brings us directly to the first few theses that Luther opens up with. And though I think that was an excellent contemporary summary of the fact, and already applying it to modern man, showing how eminently relevant it stays for us here and now, even if, I mean, the ancient context, well, not the ancient, the medieval context of Erfurt is far removed from us. The heart of the matter is just as relevant, because at the end of the day, sinners don't tend to change all that often or all that much. And how could one say, uber religious humans who want to climb the ladder up to God don't change all that much either. So perhaps, I don't know what you think, but should we go through the first few theses and see how we progress?
Yeah, let me just read the first one. The law of God, the most salutary doctrine of life, cannot advance man on his way to righteousness, but rather hinders him. Yeah.
I mean, I think we should give pause here, even so I think I will be doing most of the commentary on the historical relevance of this statement, and then Tristan will, in his elegant modern fashion, apply it to our context. But I mean, just on the basis of that, that flies directly in the face of the base impulses of Roman Catholic religiosity of the period, definitely. But I think one can even make an argument for through the ages, because the statement is here made that the law of God, most salutary doctrine of life, cannot advance us on our way to righteousness. And that's already, how could one say, difficult enough in itself to accept. But then he says, but rather it hinders him. I mean, the law of God, the good things which God calls us to do in this life, does not get us any closer to him. Rather, it gets us further away from him. I mean, that's quite a statement to make. How would you?
So here, I think as modern thinkers, we can immediately think of how we set standards for ourselves, or how we have these high ethical expectations, like, that we have to live a perfectly pure life, or that we have to achieve a certain success, for our family, or for our group of people, our community. Or, we have this idea that we are the image of God. So there is that ideal. There's that ideal of a human person. And through the law of God, or through God's help, we can basically achieve that ideal. And the more we think about this ideal and try to get there, the more we actually fail. Luther tried to be perfect and to confess everything and try to get rid of every sin, and he couldn't quite get there. And today I see a lot of it happening still. People thinking in the church they have to present a certain image, which, I mean, even I do that. I think I have to present a certain image of myself, that I am at least right, a certain standard of righteousness enough to be part of the church, or that I, have the right
enough.
kind of, exactly. I meet that standard. And that standard, now, that's not exactly all that Luther means with the law of God.
Definitely, yeah.
But I would say where it often becomes the most problem in my context is these standards, these ideals that we try to reach, because God does put forth the commandments which tell us how we ought to live, and give us those rules that we have to stick to. And the law can also be good in that God gives us, points us in certain ways that we should form a society, that we should have families, and that we should conduct ourselves as individuals. But there is always a point where this trying to do something, or trying to focus on what I can do in terms of this goal that God has set for me, there's always a point where that basically drives us into more embarrassment about ourselves, or more
Definitely.
shame.
Despair.
Despair, exactly.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. I mean, reading this and just thinking, I know I'm not going to get into any sort of a political commentary here, but just earlier today, I watched a video commenting on the religiosity of Donald Trump, because it's a big issue in America, whether the leader of the free world is a Christian or not a Christian or whatsoever. But then the person authoring the video made this great argument, or this elaborate argument, that, just listen to Trump. What he says is, I believe in heaven and I believe in hell, and if you're good, you go to heaven, and if you're bad, you go to hell. And I find that so emblematic and so representative of a very widespread misconception of the Christian faith these days. Well, it's always been there, but I think especially prevalent in a cultural form of Christianity, the idea that, you know, God gives me the means to be a basically good person. And if I am a basically good person and I feel sorry enough about those aspects which aren't so good, then I go to heaven. But if I'm bad and I just do what I want and I go my own way, then I go to hell. You know, and I find Luther here in the very first thesis completely obliterates that, because he says, yes, the law of God is indeed the most salutary doctrine of life, but it profits us naught when it comes to the matter of righteousness. And maybe we must, like we elaborated on the theological words of penance and sin, etc. I think righteousness is also one which we must unpack here. Righteousness, in the thought of these medieval theologians, concerns our standing before God. In the face of God, are we righteous? Are we just? Are we in proper standing with him, or are we not? And I think Luther puts it perfectly here, that by means of doing good works, by means of doing morally good works, you cannot make yourself acceptable to God, just as you've mentioned. Rather, by thinking that you can, you make yourself even less acceptable than you already are.
Exactly. Because you keep on thinking what the ideas that you have, or the, I don't know, the great way of life that you have can somehow be
Save you.
I don't know, be glorified, or you know, glorious enough. You have to have that kind of glorious. And the thing is also, without getting too theological or philosophical, I think Luther was also speaking against this idea that of righteousness in terms of honor and value. Like, this is not necessarily talking of righteousness and that we reach a certain value that is enough for God. This is righteousness, and this his idea of righteousness is that we are basically in a court of law where we are being now judged according to the law, but then suddenly, as we will probably discuss later, this according to the law, we are guilty, definitely. But according to Christ and what Christ did, there we have a witness, or basically, how do you say? You basically have a way of getting out.
Yes, perhaps to stop us from jumping the gun, we will say that these first theses, the discussion that we will be having, are going to complicate the matter further and further. We're even going to end this podcast on a note of complication, on a note of frustration.
Yes.
You can't see a way out. But as we progress, I think in our final part of the theology on the cross, there will be a resolution. So we will get there. And yes, wink, wink, Christ is the answer. But we'll arrive.
Okay. But let me then just focus on what I wanted to say about sin. Basically, is that we can still often have today this idea that our sins accumulate, and basically the more negative points you've got, the worse it is, and the more positive points you need to basically balance these negative points out. So you see this in, for example, you know, people really doing so much good for other people, and you know, being real examples, and again, I'm not just pointing fingers. I do the same. Is you know, sometimes to cover up what I do something really good so that no one realizes my real faults.
Yep.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And that's how we use the law to think that we are righteous.
Yes.
But it actually hinders us, because we're living a kind of double standard, or deceiving ourselves.
I agree with you. And I think it also hinders us in the fact that it directs us to ourselves. You know, it gives us this imaginary situation in which we can make up for the evil that we have done by doing, you know, at least as much good or more. And that's hindrance, because it, at the end of the day, doesn't allow us to despair as we should. And then it doesn't allow us to grab onto the solution, which we will get to.
And I mean, I think that ties perfectly into what you said about that comment from Trump about if you do good and if you do bad, either you go to hell or heaven.
Exactly, yeah.
That's not what distinguishes us as Christians.
No.
If that was really what distinguished us, then we could even say we're similar to Islam or to
Any other
other
religion.
religions. Yeah, who basically where you can be holy based on your merits,
Exactly.
what you do.
Exactly.
And we're not, yeah.
Perhaps
That
just
first distinction is important.
it is very important. But perhaps to push on, because I think so we've been talking now very
Yeah.
much about righteousness, vertical righteousness, before our standing before God,
Yes.
in the forensic sense. But I think this second thesis touches very much upon something that you've already mentioned, a more horizontal sort of righteousness, us living up to human ideals that we've created there for ourselves, becoming more virtuous, becoming better people, more successful people, etc. Not necessarily focusing in on morality, but on success and on accomplishment in life, accumulating temporal or earthly worth. I mean, the second thesis, do you want to read it for us?
Okay, I'll read it. Much less can human works, which are done over and over again with the aid of natural precepts, so to speak, lead to that end of being righteous.
Exactly. Yes, yeah, to that end of being righteous. So neither the law of God, which gives us these moral commands in order to do good, nor can human works, meaning works of reason, our employment of, this is also something very big in the Catholic system, is this concept of virtue, accumulating virtue for ourselves, becoming better exercised human beings, more able to resist base temptations, closer to our full potential. Neither that can make you righteous. Neither that can make you worthy of God's acceptance. It doesn't make up for any of the wrong that you've done.
Definitely.
Yeah, and I think you've.
Yeah, I mean, we can also often think that our being judged by other people is the same kind of judgment that God has over us. So if someone says that was a terrible thing you did, then at some point we might feel like, yeah, maybe that's God also telling me you're being way too sinful now, and which you do often need that confrontation from the Holy Spirit, but that God is now basically telling me I've gone too far off the right path, so now I need to try and get back.
Yes, you're damaged goods, and
so
not worthy.
So do
of
a few
life.
good things so you get back to the right path.
Yes, indeed. I even hear a little whispering of Tillich here, in that somehow I think sometimes when we fail miserably at life, just generally, nothing works out. None of our plans, none of our ideals, none of our New Year's resolutions. Then we have sometimes this knowing little voice that tells us that you don't deserve to be. You don't deserve to even exist. And yeah, there we go.
You were actually listening to me.
I do listen very well. But so yeah, I think something of that also plays a role here. Luther says that even if that bloody voice whispered to you that you do deserve to be and you're doing a bloody good job of life, still you are not 1 inch closer to deserving God's acceptance.
Yeah. And maybe just to start closing off, I think that is what Luther is basically saying here. If we're talking about righteousness and my standing before God, before we talk about any of that and what Christ did, let's just shut up that voice of the law.
Yes.
and then see what wonderful gifts God has given us. But as long as that voice of the law is still there, and we still think it as a role to play somehow.
I agree with you, and we're going to get much deeper into that very point. But perhaps if we can just finish off with thesis 3, because I think that's going to give people something to chew on. Although the works of man always seem attractive and good, they are nevertheless likely to be mortal sins. Now, remember again this mortal sins that we were talking about in the beginning. Luther says here that even your good works, though they seem attractive and good, your good works and the good works of the law, though they seem attractive and good, they are most likely to be things that you do that if you trust in them and if you hold on to them, they will separate you eternally from God. And I think, oh, that's such a controversial statement, but I think it strikes so true to proper evangelical theology. And Tristan, I know I'm talking a lot now, but I just quickly want to throw in
evangelical Lutheran theology.
Yes, we'll get to that somewhere in the future as well.
Yeah.
Evangelical is originally Lutheran, but in any case,
yeah.
Just a quick story regarding this precise point there, and I hope there's time for it. I think there is. There was this wonderful little old Lutheran man in a congregation where I had been a member previously, and I remember when he died, it was a great shock to the community, and he was really a bastion, and such a soft-spoken, wise old man. And I remember being at his house, with his wife and all of his children coming from all over the world before the funeral. And I asked his one son, how's he doing? And he says, no, he's all right, but it's kind of sad for the whole family that their elder brother can't be there because he's an Orthodox Jew. He left the Lutheran faith and he became an Orthodox Jew. And I asked him, well, I hope it's not offensive, but how did he become an Orthodox Jew? And the son gave a few moments, and he thought, and he said, I think my elder brother never could quite understand grace. And I was listening to this and I thought to him, well, that's interesting. And what made you understand it? And he immediately had a story. He said, once I was standing in the kitchen with my dad and my brother got a present and I didn't. And I remember tugging on my dad's jacket and I said, Dad, how come my elder brother gets a present? I deserve a present as well. And the old man looked at his son dead in the eye and he said to him, son, you deserve nothing but hell. And it strikes me as a very, very Lutheran. It's a terrible story, but it's a very Lutheran thing. You know, that your good works, everything is deserving of nothing else than hell.
What do you think you deserve now, really?
Exactly.
Okay, we've only got a few minutes, but I'm just going to end on this one. In case anyone thinks this is not biblical, Galatians 2. Nobody can be justified in God's eyes by the works of the law, but only by faith in Christ.
Amen.
And I guess that leads on to our next topic. Like, comment, and subscribe.
Have a good night, everybody. Cheers.
Cheers.